Hey guys, welcome to another challenge. And today we have two sentences. And these would also appear to be quite simple because they all start with a subject and are followed by the predicate. Um, there's also some really curious features, and we're going to find out what the use of as is when it comes to this sentence here. So, what I want to do first is I want to divide out the sentences into parts using punctuation. So we have this. And we have our dash again, right? If you recall, using dashes for dramatic purposes in trying to explain something that was said before. So we have that, and we have another comma right here. So here it is. Visually, we have divided this out. That means our first sentence, fairly long, with no punctuation, and our second sentence is broken up into one, two, three, four different parts. All right, let's start with our subject and predicate. So we got gaps, okay, as our subject, and I should, circle it like we always do. Now, we have between, okay? Clearly, this is not a predicate. It is a preposition because if I say between what? Between buildings, it's a description of the gaps, which means it's going to be right beside the subject. So when you see something like this, don't panic. You could also take this and put it behind narrow. In this case, the author simply wanted you to remember which gaps he or she is talking about. And our predicate is all the way here following the object of the preposition. So gaps between what? Buildings, and there is my predicate, narrow. Okay. And again, you could say the gaps narrow between the buildings. Okay. Would there be a difference in comprehension, you think, if we put between the buildings after and as of before? I think visually they might make a bit of a difference because you are experiencing a motion of narrowness versus here is just describing the already existing gaps between buildings, and you're not getting that visual representation of them all of a sudden narrowing. So if you really think about it, it makes a little bit of a difference of imagery, but comprehension-wise, it's the same thing. We got a conjunction, and, okay? And there is another subject, so roads, and we have a predicate, all right? So out of this one sentence that we thought originally was one sentence, we have two separate sentences joined by and. Okay, and then we have as. So the curious story about as can be used as a preposition. So for example, I worked as a waiter. Okay, so worked in this case would be a verb of motion. Therefore, it would not really take a direct object. So imagine I'm working on my paper, not I'm working paper. And again, one of those verbs that does not require a direct object. Therefore, preposition of as a waiter is where it would make sense. Now, as can also be used as a conjunction, which means it can join another idea together. It is temporal in nature, meaning that it tells time. I was walking as it rained. It gives you an image of raining at the same time as you're walking. So you can even replace as when. So for example, the roads are smoother when we near the heart of the city, but as is an indicator, a conjunction that tells us, hey, something's happening at the same time as another thing is happening. So if this is a conjunction, expect to see the subject, which we do, right next to it, we, and predicate near. Okay. All right. Next sentence, the building. Again, subject. And then we have that. All right. So that in English is used a lot of times. And I think I mentioned this to you guys before. But in kind of modern day English, that can be used as something called a relative pronoun. And if you're confused about what relative means, it's pretty much relative. It's a relative of something. So if I ask you who's your relative, you're going to say my cousins or my uncles, which means they're related to you in some way. Words work the same. If you have a relative pronoun, which technically should be which, okay, or who, or whom, uh, or even whose, okay, these are more, I think, common. And when you see which, who, you're not really confused because the use of that typically that introduces indirect statements. Any verb of thinking, speaking, are going to have that. I said that, or I think that. When using that as a relative pronoun, what it does, it's supposed to show a more of a derogatory or more of a um, more of an emphasis on a specific thing that's related to it. So if I say the building which was once called the Sears Tower, perfect relative pronoun, no problem. But the moment I say that was once called the Sears Tower, what the author's pointing out or what the writer's pointing out is that building over there. Okay, so if you ever read Shakespeare in junior high or in senior high or in university, you'll notice that Shakespeare uses a lot of that when referring to villains or very specific people. So when you're using the relative pronoun, if unless you're being very, very specific, all right, use that. If not, stick to which or who. It's a lot easier that way. All right, so now that we know that this is a relative pronoun, what we need to do is we can separate it out even further. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to take this and I'm going to separate. That was once called the Sears Tower. Okay, that is actually one separate sentence, then another one, and then guess where our predicate is? Right here, emerges. Okay, this is why it's called a relative pronoun introducing something called a relative clause, which means it's a sentence within a sentence. Okay, and a lot of us do this subconsciously. My friend who goes to Holy Cross School is now going to, I don't know, Father Wheelahan. Okay, so notice that when we put that who in there, we're dropping another clause and we are putting a sentence within a sentence. So we can totally dismiss it because we can just say the building emerges from the fog. The rest is just describing the building. Okay, so going back to our relative clause here, where do you think the subject is? If you guess that the subject is that, you are correct because the predicate is was. Called and once is an adverb. Okay. And then in our dash is another sentence. We, predicate, call. Perfect. So now that we have our subject and predicate, we can now look at all the other noun cases. So we got the gaps, we got the object of the preposition here, the predicate, conjunction, roads, and then we got a linking verb, are. So the moment you see something like is, are, was, were, etc., those are all linking verbs. And the great thing about linking verbs is that they are going to describe the subject right away. Okay, so when I'm saying smoother, which is right here, this is a predicate nominative describing the roads. Now, smooth, it would be the correct adjective if you're describing the roads. Smoother is a comparative adjective. Okay, so again, the roads aren't just smooth, they are smoother as we come to the city center. All right, so we near, what do we near? The heart. There's my direct object right here. And remember that of always introduces the possessive. That's correct. There's of, and the city is a possessive. Okay, so who owns the heart? The city owns the heart. Next, the building, here's my subject, emerges. Okay, I jump straight to emerges. I dismiss the relative clause and I've dismissed what's in the dashes right now because in my mind, I'm forming ideas, and I'm forming them first before I separate them. And I think when you guys are doing your comprehension, especially in the future, when you're reading and you find your subject and you can't find your predicate and you find so many different things in between, chances are this is where you may run into a few problems when you're facing questions about a particular topic in the reading. If you keep it to subject predicate, you have more control over what you see. So the idea is not that the building was once called the Sears Tower. The idea is that the building emerges. Okay? If we have a lot more relative clauses here, that information will get lost as you go. That is why I'm not going to go into this relative clause here in the dashes. I'm jumping straight from building to emerges. Now remember, emerging is a verb of motion. It doesn't take a direct object. We have from as a preposition, and fog is the object of the preposition. Now, a black pillar in the skyline. So we're talking about a pillar. What is this pillar describing? Okay, notice there's no verbs here. This is a predicate, okay? A predicate nominative in this case. A pillar is describing, look, why it's important to follow your subject and predicate construction first, because that predicate nominative is far, far away from the actual subject of our sentence, okay? This is what I mean by the control of your ideas, by organizing them in your mind, because it prepares you to get the best possible grade on your comprehension, to understand how ideas are created and how they work. So this black pillar is the building predicate nominative in preposition, object of the preposition. Okay. Now we go into the details. So that is my subject was once. There's the adverb called. What was it called? It was called the Sears Tower. Another predicate nominative. But in this case, we could say building, and you would be kind of right, because the Sears Tower is the building. But grammatically, it actually is describing that. Okay, so if you were to ask, well, what is the relative or the antecedent or the predicate nominative, what is Sears Tower referring to? The most correct answer would be that. And then what do we call it? Now, it is going to be a direct object, and we call it the hub. What do you think this is now referring to? Technically, you would be right. It is the building. But because it's in its own separate clause, it's actually describing it. See that? Okay, so again, the importance of looking at your sentences slowly, remembering your noun cases, and sticking to the subject predicate formula is going to give you a lot of success, especially when you're facing down these very long sentences in your reading. Okay, keep it simple. And once you keep it simple, you can expand using what you know about noun cases. All right, last thing we need to do is the verb tenses. So gaps, narrow. Gaps, third person, plural, present, active, indicative. And then we have roads also are going to be. So we're going to put 2 times third person, plural, present, active, indicative, because roads are also plural. We near, that's first person, plural, present, active, indicative. Oh, and I'm sorry, I forgot. It should be simple. Okay, simple. Next, we got the building. We got third person singular again. Now, was once called, we are going, the building emerges, see, is once again singular, present, simple, indicative. And once again, seeing that emerges belongs to building would stop you from saying that that is a third person imperfect, which is what the next one is. That was once called is third singular. This is imperfect, simple, indicative. Now you're going to ask me, well, Mr. G, how do you know that this is an imperfect? It's imperfect because the adverb once tells you that once upon a time, we don't exactly know when, but once upon a time, it was called Sears Tower. And this is what imperfects do. They give you the past tense, but they don't really necessarily tell you the exact time of when something happened. All we know is that it happened in the past. We call, once again, first person plural present indicative, so we can do 2 times that, and that's it. That's all it is. So we got we got 6 verbs present in 2 separate sentences. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching and for making it to the end of this video and for learning a little bit more about as a conjunction and as a pronoun. And we've also learned about the relative clause today and using relative pronouns which, who, whom, and whose, as opposed to just that. Don't forget, that is only used when you want to put emphasis on a relative noun you're trying to describe. Okay? Thank you so much for watching. See you guys tomorrow. Bye.